My name is Melanie Kress, and I am the Associate Curator for Highline Art, the public art program presented by the Highline in New York City. I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for the second conversation in our six-part speaker series titled The Normalizing Gaze Surveillance from Drones to Phones, with this panel discussion being called Art, Artists, and Conflict. The series is organized in conjunction with artist Sam Durant's Highline Plinth Commission Untitled Drone, which opened this spring and will be on view on the Highline at 30th Street through August 2022. Untitled Drone is a large-scale fiberglass sculpture in the shape of an abstracted drone sitting atop a 25-foot tall steel pole. This work continues Highline Art's mission of presenting new, powerful, thought-provoking artworks that generate and amplify some of today's most important conversations. Inspired by this artwork, the speaker series brings together artists, activists, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists to demystify the twinned histories of surveillance and drone warfare, illuminate routine examples of surveillance in our daily lives, and highlight the important role of artists in these conversations. The Normalizing Gaze is presented by the Highline with the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, a nonprofit advocacy organization and legal services provider that litigates and advocates for privacy, working to abolish local government systems of mass surveillance. As we begin, I have a few announcements regarding the logistics of the event. These will also be included in the chat. All attendee videos are automatically turned off and microphones muted. Throughout the presentation and discussion, we invite you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I will select from your questions throughout the conversation. If you have any technical issues, please send them in a Q&A as well. And lastly, in the coming days after this series, a recording of this event will be posted on the Highline's website for future viewing. Although we are in virtual space together, before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I come to you today from Brooklyn, New York, on the ancestral land of the Lenape and Canarsie. If you are interested in finding out the name of the indigenous people whose land we live on, please visit the link in the chat. Today's panel, Art, Artists, and Conflict, as I mentioned, is convened on the occasion of Sam Durant's Plinth Commission Untitled Drone. For some context before we get started, the Highline Plinth is the newest format of Highline Art, a series of monumental scale commissions located on the Spur, the newest section of the Highline to open to the public at 30th Street and 10th Avenue. The Spur and the Plinth offer sweeping views of the city down the avenue and across the streets and provide an opportunity for artists to think on a very large scale and engage with the site's surroundings. We select the artworks in the Plinth by a proposal process, which every 3 years invites artists, curators, and museum directors and arts administrators from around the world to nominate artists for the opportunity. These artists are invited to submit proposals, which we then narrow down to a short list, and those proposals are shown in small maquettes or sculptural models on the Highline. Every 3 years, we then invite 2 of those finalists to show their artworks on the Plinth for 18 months. Sam's project was selected from the inaugural shortlist alongside Simone Lee's Brick House, the inaugural Plinth Commission that debuted in 2019. Alongside Sam's Plinth artwork, we have organized a series of public engagements that Sam will speak more about momentarily, including this series hosted here. And for today's conversation, we are honored to be joined by Sam and 2 incredible artists, Coco Fusco and Naeem Mohaiemen, who will engage in a conversation on artists' roles, responsibilities, and tactics around presentations and examinations of conflict. To ground the discussion today on this broad topic, I've asked the 3 artists each to prepare a presentation sharing one example of their own work and one artwork by another artist. Following their presentations, we will then open up to a conversation and audience Q&A at the end. And now to introduce our amazing panelists. Across drawings, sculptures, installations, and community-driven public projects, Sam Durant examined the ways in which groups of people make their values visible and heard in public space. His work is represented in major collections worldwide, including Tate in London, the Whitney Museum of American Art and Museum of Modern Art in New York, Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and the Stedelijk Museum in Ghent. Coco Fusco is an interdisciplinary artist and writer. She is a recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, American Academy of Arts and Letters Award, Fulbright Fellowship, and Herb Alpert Award in the Arts. Fusco's performances and videos have been presented in the 56th Venice Biennale, Frieze Special Projects, Basel Unlimited, 2 Whitney Biennials in 2008 and 1993, and several other international exhibitions. Her works are in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, Centre Pompidou, the Imperial War Museum, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona. Naeem Mohaiemen researches forms of utopia, dystopia, and malleable belonging, sometimes beginning from South Asia's two post-colonial markers in 1947 and 1971, and then radiating outward to unlikely and unstable transnational alliances, such as Japanese skyjackers, German adventurers, Lebanese conscripts, or a Dutch journalist. He is a 2021 Senior Fellow at the Lender Institute of American Art. Without further ado, I would like to invite Sam to join us on video and share his presentation. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to everyone who's joined for the conversation tonight. So I'll speak a bit about the Untitled Drone project that's on the Highline. Some of you may have already seen it, hopefully, those of you that are in New York. So Melanie, maybe if, I don't know if we're looking at the presentation yet. We'll see when that first slide comes up. So Gesundheit, whoever that was. I don't know if the audience could hear that, but there was a good sneeze. Anyway, yeah. So this is the work installed on the spur, the Highline spur, which is a small section that crosses 10th Avenue at 23rd. Just the gateway to the Hudson Yards. So one of the things I was thinking about several years ago when the drone warfare program was being initiated during the Bush administration and then into the Obama administration, was the fact that it was kind of quietly taking place far away from the United States. And there was really very little impact or awareness of this program that seemed somehow very different in terms of how force was being projected in other parts of the world, how this connected to the war on terror, which was seemed to be a very different kind of warfare, and one that, simply was not, the costs simply were not being felt of this war in the US. So my idea was really to make visible something, a very, let's say, archetypal symbol of this new kind of modality of warfare taking place far away. And the idea then to propose it for this site in New York was to bring that, bring the war home, in a sense, in a representational sense. Of course, that was a slogan from the Vietnam War era, famously used or infamously used by the Weather Underground, detonating bombs in the US to bring the war home. So my work was not to bring the violence home, but to bring a representational image home, and in a sense, use that to sort of cast a shadow in public space, and to provoke or instigate somehow awareness and discussion about this new form of warfare. And I think this is really, certainly people in the military are talking about a very different kind of warfare from what I think we're used to from the past, from the 20th century. We're in a different age, a different type of force being used in different ways. So this work was really meant to bring that back into New York. And maybe we'll talk a little bit also about the relationship to public art. And of course, if this were a smaller scale work, or even a work of the same size inside a museum, it has a very different impact. So the fact of it being so visible in public space in the city, I think is something important about particularly this concept of like, how do artists deal with conflict, and how do we, particularly those of us that are concerned, politically, morally, ethically concerned with conflict and its consequences in the world. How do we, in a sense, represent that in a way that moves us towards less violence and more peace, more justice, etc., in the world. So I hope this work is something that does that. I will say that the process of was several years in the making, and the process of designing and tweaking, and we spent, and I spent an enormous amount of time actually discussing what this thing should look like. Should it be an exact reproduction of a Predator drone or a Reaper drone with all the missiles and the surveillance things and like that all on there? And thinking through the implications of that, I moved more and more towards a very abstracted form. So trying to strip it down to its sort of essence, to its iconic sense, in a way that would not be so threatening, because I think particularly during the Trump years, people were not feeling great. So people were feeling under threat and afraid and so forth. So the idea was not to scare people or to traumatize people, but to get them to think about the issue in a way that wouldn't turn them off immediately. So that's kind of the line that I'm walking. I mean, this drone is a machine of power, control, aggression, and violence, and I wanted to make sure that that was part of the work, but not that it was actually the work. So to keep it in the realm of the representation. And I worked with a really amazing fabricator in California to design this and build it, put it together, engineer it, and it was for me, it was quite an amazing process. And it's certainly the largest, most complicated sculpture that I've ever made. And the guys that fabricated it were just pretty terrific. So the experience was really wonderful. Because of the subject matter of the drone and drone warfare, we wanted to really do a lot of public programming, provide a lot of information about all the implications of it. And, like I say, because it's largely invisible in mainstream American discourse, there was a real desire to bring forward a lot of information for those that were interested in it. So the Highline team, Melanie, Kress, did an incredible job of assembling all of these panels that are going on throughout the next 18 months. So I'm very proud of and impressed with what we've been able to accomplish. In addition, we made like a zine, an artist zine, and worked with a really terrific designer to try and really explain all of the complexity that's involved in the notion of unmanned drone warfare, surveillance, the technological apparatuses, and the sort of global reach, and try to, boil that down into more understandable and frankly compelling. This gets into technical stuff that I think a lot of people are, not so interested in. So the idea was to make it also appealing. And you know, I think it's really a terrible irony that, you know, as the US pulls out of Afghanistan, finally ending the forever war, and we have the anniversary of September 11th, and we have a drone strike in retribution for the IS bombings at the Kabul airport. And it turns out after the US government says that they made a righteous strike on an IS leader, it turns out that they've killed a man and his family, including 7 children, who's actually an aid worker working for a US aid firm in Afghanistan, driving around delivering water to people because the water's been shut off in Kabul. So I think this is a really, you know, again, the consequences of this unmanned drone warfare are, again, so relevant in the moment, unfortunately. And I think this brings me to the question of how does one represent atrocity, you know, conflict at its most extreme, violence, massacre, and genocide. And I think Alfredo Jar, for me, has always been a huge influence, and I've learned so much from his work and the way that he's worked through representing conflict, tragedy, atrocity, and so forth. And I think this work that he did so many works in Rwanda, as you see, from 1994 to 2010, he's doing work about the genocide in Rwanda. But I think this particular point when I think it was on his first trip to this area in Rwanda, to see some of the sites where massacres occurred. And he's there with his camera and a guide. And what does one take a picture of when you're at the site of a massacre where there's a grave, there's a mass grave right in front of you? How does one represent something like that? And here he's standing at that point, and he takes a picture of the sky, the cloud above, this totally quotidian image. It could be anywhere. And I think there's something incredibly powerful and moving in that. And here's the drawing where he shows where he took the picture. So he has notes from the locations where these pictures were taken. So the actual, let's say the site of the violence, the site of the atrocity is not represented. And you know, in our brief time here, I don't want to go into the long explanation of how he went through a process of early in his career representing you know, people, workers in gold mines and so forth, and this incredible kind of images of human suffering. And he realized that this was a kind of re-traumatization and a somewhat problematic way of trying to represent this issue. It wasn't working for him in the way that he wanted to in his work. And so I think this idea of taking the picture of somewhere else is such a powerful response. It says so much about one's relationship to something like this. You know, the single person, he's one person facing this atrocity, and the sense of loss, of powerlessness, helplessness, etc., in the face of this. So I'll leave it there and hand it over to our next esteemed colleague. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. So much for us to dive into in conversation. Coco, could you join us for your presentation?
Hi. So I'm sorry for the sneeze. That was me. Okay, thank you, Sam. I'll save my comments about your work and stuff for later and just get into what I'm going to talk about now. If I put on mine, will it share? Yes. Yay. Okay. So we're going to move to another part of the world now and talk about Cuba for a minute and slideshow. Okay, so this is just a quick prelude before I talk about. So my probably most dominant body of work in the last few years has been dealing with Cuba and the situation in Cuba and the human rights situation and the struggles of artists to create conditions for the elaboration of civil liberties and respect for human rights on the one hand, and also to develop strategies for intervention in a highly censored culture environment. And but I had started going to Cuba and working with artists there in the 80s, but I didn't use cameras because at the time that would have drawn unfavorable attention. It really wasn't until the kind of late aughts when Fidel Castro stepped down and Raúl took over that it became a little bit more relaxed in terms of people coming in with cameras. And so the first project I did actually was inspired by the Arab Spring in 2011, when all these people were going to public plazas in different countries and protesting, and there was a lot of conversation among Cubans about why they were not. And so I did this video essay called The Empty Plaza, which was shot in the famous Plaza of the Revolution in Havana, and that little red speck there is me alone. And I was kind of making a commentary on the significance, the political significance of that emptiness. And I incorporated into it a lot of selfies that I pulled from the internet, because just about every tourist who goes to Cuba wants to take a picture of themselves in front of either Che Guevara, as you can see in some of the photos here, or in front of Camilo Cienfuegos, in front of these figures on the ministries. And this is, and I contrast the empty plaza of the present day with the kind of iconic images of the plaza from the early stages of the revolution, because this was kind of Fidel's principal stage for dramatizing what he wanted everybody to believe, which was that the entire population of Cuba supported him in the revolution. And so he would stage these events in the plaza and bring hundreds of thousands of people to the plaza in order to dramatize that relationship. My piece was a collaboration with a Cuban journalist, Yoani Sanchez, who was the first blogger to get a lot of attention. And she was very daring, an independent journalist who kind of went out on a limb from the island and started talking about real problems that were happening there, and has been subject to all kinds of mistreatment over the years, but she stuck it out. And with the help of private investors, she was able to start an online newspaper a few years ago called 14 y Medio. So you see her on the bottom here with some of her editorial team. Okay, so that's a prelude to, you know, after that, I've made a series of videos that look at different confrontations between Cuban poets and the political order from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then most recently, in the wake of an artist protest at the end of last year, I started working with members of the 27N group, which was the group that emerged from the protests in November of 2020. And we decided to do a piece that would commemorate the forced confession of the poet Eberto Padilla, which was probably the most famous case of the repression of an artist in Cuba from the early years of the revolution. And it really marked a moment in which all of the international left that had been flying to Havana and having parties in the 60s and shaking hands with Fidel kind of assessed the situation and it was a kind of parting of ways in which some people decided to continue to support the revolution, but many intellectuals like Vargas Llosa and Sartre and Goitisolo and Susan Sontag and others decided to pull away. And the reason for this was that this poet, Eberto Padilla, who you can see here, he's the one with the yellow subtitles, was basically targeted as a counter-revolutionary because of a book of poems that he wrote called Outside the Game. And he began to become subjected to a lot of harsh treatment and surveillance, and he got kind of isolated from his associates and lost his jobs and the ability to publish. And eventually he was arrested in 1971, accused of being a mercenary collaborator with the CIA or whatever you want to call it. It's usually a variation on that, and basically subjected to 36 days of psychological torture and then forced to make a public confession, like a Stalinist show trial kind of thing, in front of all his colleagues at the headquarters of the Artists and Writers Union. And this confession is quite infamous in the history of the Cuban Revolution. All the superstar intellectuals in Cuba were there. Nobody wanted to talk about it afterwards. But anyway, Padilla went on for nearly 2 hours and to satisfy the state security agents that were around the room, kind of egging him on, in which he condemned himself as a counter-revolutionary and called out his wife and several of his associates and said that they were also counter-revolutionaries, and so they had to come up and do their mea culpas as well. The event was filmed, and then the film disappeared. In other words, nobody had access to it for more than 40 years. But the transcript of the confession was printed and distributed to all the embassies in Cuba and sent to many press agencies. And the government thought that they, with this, had proof that they were right in arresting him, but it had the complete opposite effect. It really alienated people from the Cuban government. Anyway, this spring was the 50th anniversary of that confession. And so I took the transcript and invited 20 Cuban writers and intellectuals and artists, broke it up into sections and invited them all to read parts of the transcript and then wove them all together. And it was a really kind of revelation for all of them, because many of them had heard about it but had never actually read the thing, and it's pretty terrifying in its insanity. But anyway, we're all working in different parts of the world. Some people sent material from Europe, some people were in Cuba, some people were in the States. So I asked everybody to just send me cell phone videos. And it was not easy to get them out of Cuba, but we did it. It's so that I could edit everything together and try to make it look like it had been filmed in 1971. So this is the project, and then it was streamed on the day of the anniversary. 5 cultural institutions, several museums, and also the organization Artists at Risk Connection streamed it all day long. So it was streamed in Germany and England, a couple of places in the United States, in Miami at PAM, and so on. And then now it's available on the internet. And among the participants were several members of 27N, but also some artists who had been imprisoned for their work, like the person who's at the bottom left here, Nestor Diaz de Villegas. So that's me and my work with 27N. And one of the members of 27N is Hamlet Lavastida, who you can see here in my background, who is currently in prison. He's been in there for 80 days now. He was taken into custody on June 26th. He's a very interesting artist who I've done lots of work with and written about his work. And I'm going to show you this piece that he did in Berlin recently. He was on he was at a residency at the Künstlerhaus Britannien for a year before he went back to Cuba and got arrested. And he created this piece very much in the spirit of the way his work has been for many, many years, which is he works with graphics and information from archival information from the early years of the Cuban Revolution to kind of subvert the meaning of the graphics or to tease out hidden meanings of the graphics. And also he works with texts from famous political speeches and turns them into stencils that he can then put on walls to kind of recall and to highlight the contrast between the sort of utopian ideals expressed in some of those speeches and the kind of harsh realities of Cuba in the present day. For this particular piece, he compared and contrasted two transcripts. One was the letter of apology that Padilla, the poet I was just talking about, wrote in 1971, in which he was trying to excuse himself before the grand masters of the revolution. And the other is a very interesting transcript of this guy, photographer, Javier Caso, who is Cuban but lives in the United States, but went in 2020 to visit Cuba. And he's friends with dissident artists and intellectuals. He was called in by state security and told that he was, had to submit to an interrogation while he was there. But he wired himself with a recording device that they did not find on him. So he was able to record his conversation with these security agents who were trying to convince him that the people he was hanging out with were all CIA paid mercenaries and horrible, and that he shouldn't be associating with them, and so on and so forth. So he got out of there and he took the recording and sent it to one of the so-called dissident filmmakers, Miguel Coyula, who made this video with the conversation. And many people have been subject to interrogation. Many intellectuals have written about their interrogations based on their memories, but there was no documentary evidence of the actual back and forth of an interrogation before this. And so when this video was posted to the internet and to social media, it caused quite a it was a sensation. And after that, state security has instituted a new protocol, which is that everybody has to be strip searched before interrogation to prevent this from happening again. So Hamlet took the transcript of the exchange with the agents and then turned that into part of his piece. Okay, that's all. I hope I didn't go over too much.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Coco. So tempting to dive into conversation immediately. But Naeem, can you please join us for your presentation, and then we'll have all of us together.
Sure. Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Coco and Sam, everyone, for having me here. I will just, before sharing my slides, just wanted to say, since the series is called the Normalizing Gaze, I wanted to think back a little bit as to how certain things got normalized, not only the existence of drones as now a standard part of the US armament of global control, but also our obliviousness to other forms of self-surveillance. In some ways, Sam's sculpture is so gigantic that there is no missing it. It's hidden in plain sight. I saw actually somebody already wrote in the comments about walking by and photographing their niece in front of it. So it's very visible. And it's of course it's installed in the High Line, which is also a major venue for people visiting New York. So it's in some ways my best idea of certain kind of interventions that will take a lot of people by surprise. And so for my generation and the works we've done collectively and separately, coming from an identity as new immigrants in New York, for whom about our 10th year of living in New York was the beginning of 9/11. I want to go back to that just to talk about how much things have changed, how much things have normalized, how much we have even lost the language to protest against something when it has been in the landscape for so long. And of course, how some of those things are no longer necessary because we now do the state's work for the state through all the things that we, including myself, participate in. And today is September 16th, so we are just 5 days away from 9/11. So maybe a good time to come back to, for me at least, where a lot of both of these events started and where our work started. So the title of the presentation, or at least this section of the presentation, In the Shadow of No Towers, borrows from Art Spiegelman's excellent book by the same title, one of the first books, in my opinion, that came out of the New York media landscape that even as early as 2002, 2003, started speaking critically about the war on terror at a time when that was not even discourse available in the New York Times. And just to recap, these are the covers of the week of 9/11, 2001. And then these are the covers, 2020, last year, where the singular event dominating the landscape is, of course, the pandemic. And this is how America chose to remember 9/11 that week, in fact, that day. The New Yorker itself is a fascinating case study on how the politics around this has changed even within liberal media. If you search the New Yorker's archive, which I have a separate presentation about, you'll see that initially some of their covers traffic very directly in scare politics, racial stereotyping, etc. And then gradually they start changing. Some people may remember that the New Yorker infamously had a cover showing Barack Obama and Michelle Obama fist bumping, wearing what can only be called faux Taliban gear. So the New Yorker itself has traveled a lot from there. Whether it's improvement or not, that's a separate discussion. So coming to our work that came out in this landscape post 9/11, we were a collective of artists, activists and lawyers who came together with this specific idea that we wanted to make hyper visible that which was invisible, i.e. the subjects of this surveillance, not in Iraq or Afghanistan, but here in the United States, specifically looking at the necessity always in the American body politic to create an outsider and this conversation about loyalty. And we look back, of course, to World War I incarceration of German Americans, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, the detention of immigrants after the 1919 bomb scare, and of course, the Red Scare itself, which had very specific phenotypes that were considered to be more suspicious. And this part is called We Only Wanted to Help, because I want to just briefly talk about how sometimes you want to help with your project and you don't necessarily. We had two basic language forms that we used for all our projects at this time. One was, of course, an heightened irony, to look at something in mainstream media and talk about the irony of that representation as contrasted with the dominant representation of presumed Muslim, presumed new immigrant within the American body politic. In this case, the element that we looked at was a photo shoot by Steven Meisel, who some of you may also know for his work with Madonna in the early 1990s, among many other fashion crossovers. And this was a feature he did for Vogue Italy, which claimed in 2006 to be representing the state of what sort of persecution happens at American airports. And the prototype of the subject of such harassment for Steven Meisel were all these models in the Vogue Italy way. So we just took it over and did these little interventions where we wrote imaginary dialogue, where we tried to visit Steven Meisel's office and try to meet with the models, because we want to ask them just exactly how did you have such mild experiences at the airport that can be photographed for a fashion magazine, whereas that wasn't our experience of airports at all. The other form that we work with, which went directly with this, is to make visible those we thought precisely should be highlighted as the primary target for the surveillance regime that was unfolding in the United States already in 2004. And we would go back and forth between locating something like Stephen Meisel and then creating the counterpart. In the previous example, the counterpart is only with the text, where we stay with the Stephen Meisel palette, and then we talk about our own experiences, which are dramatically different. In this case, we would change the visual as well. The inspiration for this piece at the Queen's Museum was a series that Sarah Jessica Parker did for Gap, which was called Casual Fresh American Style. And the people chosen for the Casual Fresh American Style were, of course, a certain kind of Americana. So we inverted that and located people who had either themselves been detained in the aftermath of 9/11, or in some cases had had a family member detained. So for example, the third image from the left is a person whose father had been detained, was a Palestinian journalist, and eventually died in custody. The fourth person from the left is Chaplain James Yee, who was for some time the Muslim chaplain in Guantanamo until he was accused of being a spy and lost his job. So it's a sort of hypervisibility of those who are about to be invisible, with our dominant assumption being that by doing this, we are doing, for lack of a better term, useful work, that this will instigate a certain kind of activism around this, which will make it impossible to look away. And so this project was very much in line with this. This was 2003, 2004, when the amount of data you could get about what was happening inside the United States was quite limited. So we had managed to find one database that listed people detained in the first 12 months after 9/11 that was in the official database. It was a very small number. It was a few hundred, which now in retrospect is very clear to us that the reason was that that's all the US government was required to report, because there was a very specific request that came either from Congress or Senate to report on how many people had been detained. These were the only names that they had to share. And then we did this format, which we had used many times before, just the basic data, the name of the person, how old they were, where they were picked up, and what country they were originally from. And then the red shape spells out the words Nahnu Wahad, which in Arabic means we are one. And then the subtitle is, but really, are we one? ? And part of our discourse around it was that the act of mass arresting of presumed Muslim men, as you'll see in a subsequent slide, they weren't all Muslim anyway. Not that that matters to the surveillance state when the category is to create an other. You only have to be presumed Muslim to be considered worthy of arrest. But the other point we wanted to make is that when people were bundled together into these mass arrest projects, it also creates a certain kind of false unity between these groups, where actually situation, class differences, all of that may separate them dramatically. So there's a very significant difference between the fruit seller on Fulton Street who might get arrested because his papers are out of order, as happened very often. Papers being out of order was the most common reason for being arrested. And the software engineer who has to leave the country because his papers have expired. In the discourse of the time, they are both considered victims of post 9/11 surveillance state and hyper persecution. But their situation, both in the United States and back home, if they happen to go home, is dramatically different. And we always wanted to insert class into this conversation. And that's the form in which it appeared at the Queen's Museum. A relatively simple idea actually came from our friend and comrade Chris Myers about using rice to cover up the light boxes so that the audience has to move the rice to reveal the names gradually. But what I'm coming to here is the text I said at the beginning, where I said we only wanted to help. So here's an example where our help wasn't necessarily welcome. So the project is at the Queen's Museum. The exhibition ends. It's an exhibition called Fatal Love, South Asian American Art Now, curated by Jayashree Abichandani and Prerna Reddy, longtime associates of the Queen's Museum. And even the term South Asian American is an invention that we also subscribed to in that time because we wanted to project a unified identity. So the commonalities between somebody of Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian, Sri Lankan, Nepalese origin might be dramatic, as well as class factor. But for the sake of a unified front, we would do these projects together. So the project ends, we put this project on the website. This entire PDF is on the website. That means the text on it is searchable. which is something that I wasn't really aware of in 2004, that if you put a PDF up, there are already search engines that will index all the text within it, even though it's theoretically an image. So the website goes up and we start getting emails from this person, Rajiv Dabatkar, who tells us that we're breaching his privacy. Why is his name in our database? What's going on? You have to take my name off, et cetera, et cetera. So we start digging into it and we realize, it's a mass database. We didn't source it, but we got it from the list that the US government was required to turn over to a public interest request. That Rajiv Dabatkar is a software engineer who was on that list of people who were detained and asked to leave. The difference is that because of class mobility and because of his familiarity with software and technology and the internet, he was actually able to find himself listed on here, presumed that ours was a project to make a list of undesirables, and therefore presumed that this was a bad list to be on, and started telling us that we should take him off the list. So then we start having a correspondence. It takes some time to talk to him and understand what's going on. And finally, we say to him that, we are only taking this from a publicly accessible database. We didn't originate the database. We can theoretically take your name off of our installation, but your name is still out there. And eventually he starts being quite revelatory and says, as he says here, the 9/11 incident has not only affected me, ... not this immigration related thing again. And shares that he actually started a website called nostops.org to prevent this kind of thing happening, what happened to him. And then he says, I need to find the email address of the final point of contact. In other words, he has come across a installation in a museum. That installation has brought to his attention that his name is on this database that's publicly available, but that database is sort of hidden. Our project has brought it to the surface. Now he wants to go back to the final point of contact to clear his name. And we go back and forth a little bit. We eventually figure out which article it was. This was an actual article that came out October 17, 2001, called Tech Workers Feel the Heat. And the difference, of course, is that because Rajiv Dabatkar had access to the media, he actually managed to speak to the media and say things like, I'm completely shaken. Before his arrest, Dabatkar worked for 2 years on short-term projects for several firms, including Merrill Lynch and AT&T. And this is another thing that we came across quite often, especially among people who had worked in technology, this sudden shock at the end of the American dream. They treated me as though I was non-existent because I wasn't American. But you could sense that for a lot of people, prior to this point, the fact that their term, their tenure, their ability to work in the United States might be subject to the kindness of the state hadn't occurred to them before. And then we go on. Eventually, it doesn't really resolve. It goes on till late 2005. Don't know if he was ever able to clear his name. We stayed in touch for a while and then we lost touch. But I thought about it as an example of, when you're trying to do something and the protagonist who's in that work may not see your work as activism that can help them, that the visibility that you're trying to create is not necessarily shared by those in whose name the visibility is happening. Just very quickly, Hassan Elahi, somebody whose work we followed very closely, took a completely opposite track, which is self-surveillance. He was stopped by the FBI at an airport, and soon afterwards, with the help of Creative Capital, started doing this project where he exhaustively documented everything he did, everything he bought through a credit card that automatically uploaded the purchase, a scanner that would upload his exact GPS with the time of it. Photographs, every photograph that he took everywhere would be on this website, trackingtransients.com. Of course, every airport he ever visited. For some reason, he was obsessed with meals that he ate at the airports, and he would document those. Every hotel bed. And then, of course, every single urinal that he was in this piece, Security and Comfort, is in 2007. He goes on with this for a long time. He gets quite obsessed with self-surveillance, and his idea, which now we realize is almost impossible, but he said it at our talk in 2007, my idea is that I will throw up so much data that they won't know what to do with it. And as we've learned, the machine can digest infinite amounts of data, and putting up 1,000 photographs of urinals is not going to confound the machine, rather it'll give it even more data to process. And these images might seem, well, what's the point? But in 2005, this wasn't so common. To track yourself, even the technology to have GPS location in 2005 wasn't that common. iPhones were just about to appear. So the technology of self-surveillance had not developed. I just want to leave us with two images from two films, just to sort of get a sense of the passage of time. This is from 2009, We Live in Public by Ondi Timoner, which is done as a social experiment, but the idea that you will document yourself now will seem extremely old hat, because this is 2009. Our levels of self-surveillance available today was unimaginable then. And then this is from 2015, part of the sort of normalization of the drone, Eye in the Sky, a film with Helen Mirren. I recommend watching it just to understand the Hollywood politics. You know, it can sum down to this, that Aaron Paul, who you'll recognize from Breaking Bad, is a drone pilot with a conscience, and who, before pulling the killer trigger, will make sure that the only person killed is a genuine villain. And if there's a young girl who's selling bread or walking past a bread stand, we are meant to understand that the drone apparatus actually has that much conscience to stop and not launch the attack, because it does that kind of differentiation. Whether that's the reality or not, you know, Sam has already referred to that. So just with those two images, I'll end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naeem, and I'll invite everyone to come back on video as we head into our conversation. There are so many different places that I want to start. I just want to say, in these last couple of examples that you've brought up about dumping enough information that the machine can't understand what's happening anymore, one of the really important points that comes up over and over again around drones and around autonomous weapons and algorithms as they come up around drones is that the algorithms and what's called artificial intelligence, but isn't actually, came about because of the amount of data that we were creating and the amount of images that we were creating and the amount of videos that we were creating necessitated, for those who wanted to understand it, an algorithmic processing to try to make sense out of that data. And that often, Sam, like in the example, this doesn't exactly line up, but in the example of the drone strike that you were bringing up, the military didn't actually know the identity of the person that they were killing. They only knew his behavior patterns. And so there are things called signature strikes. And, you know, this all connects to data and the normalization of behavior patterns that then determine who is allowed to do what, or eventually even to live. But it's those patterns that become a stand-in for subjectivity. So we will get to that. But there are a few things that I wanted to pull out at the top. And really the biggest one is about visibility, hypervisibility, and invisibility. And Sam, this comes out in the design of the drone itself as an aircraft that's intended to be invisible, but then in your choices around further abstracting that object. And then in surveillance itself, that we come up against incredible amounts of visibility, and then also invisibility in terms of who can be seen and who can't be seen. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to pick up in the examples that you have, or moving further out of Sam's piece to talk more about visibility, invisibility, like Coco with no one being in the square, and hypervisibility, and how those different pieces play in your work.
I just really like the comment also that's been posted in Q&A by Sue Hilty, who wrote, "My niece from Wisconsin was here over Labor Day and we walked the High Line and I took a picture of her in the drone." And then she adds, "Thanks for clarifying this for me."
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I find is, as the older I get, you know, as Naeem expressed, we only wanted to help, but then sometimes, you know, that doesn't always work out, and so I feel a great deal of, you know, ambivalence. I mean, activism is one thing, political action is one thing. An artwork is something else. So I see a difference there, and I think that differentiation, that separation between reality and representation is very important to maintain, I think. And artwork, you know, I think it's hard to know what moves a viewer, right? I mean, one artwork can instigate or begin the process of a real transformative experience for a viewer. I know that for myself. I've had several of those. moments with an artwork. You know, but that's a very individual thing. I mean, in terms of visibility, you know, I mean, I think all of us are dealing with that in different ways. A big public sculpture has a certain degree of visibility. You know, Coco's work, particularly the work that she's doing with the Cuban artist who's right now in prison, the dimension of visibility there is more through media channels, social media and mainstream media. And so I think, you know, and of course Naeem's project that was you know, found by this one man who's a software engineer from the web. It's really fascinating. So I guess I just, you know, you guys should weigh in, but I think there's you know, there's these many different modalities of visibility.
Well, I mean, as you said, Sam, in the case of the stuff that I'm doing now, I mean, you know, the Cuban government is dead set on shutting things down and controlling information. And in the last few years, as more Cubans have gotten access to the internet on their phones, this has opened up the possibility of using the digital sphere as a meeting place. And it's also a space where those who are inside and outside can communicate on a regular basis. And, you know, I have memories of long time ago when, you know, to make a phone call, you had to make an appointment through an operator, and then they would call you back at 2 o'clock in the morning. You had like 3 minutes and that's it, right? And now, you know, people are chatting on Facebook all day long, and you might be talking to, you know, one Cuban in Norway, and another person in Germany, and another Cuban in the Dominican Republic, and another one in Brazil, and another one here. And we're all in a chat together talking as if we're in the same room. And that has changed how we all think about where we are and who we are very, very much. You know, how much others see it. That was when, for example, in 2000, at the end of 2014, when Tania Bruguera proposed to do a piece in the Plaza of the Revolution and notified people of it via internet, one of the points that emerged as a potential criticism was, well, but most Cubans don't have access to the internet, so who are you talking to, right? Who is this call for? You can't say that anymore, because of the explosion of cell phone use and the access as of 2018 of to the internet. So the internet is now the alternative source of information, and it's the alternative public sphere. So we come up with projects that can operate in the alternative public sphere, or set up something that can only happen outside. One of the reasons that, there really is no reason for Hamlet Lavastida to be in prison right now. But one of the explanations that the state security has given is that they pulled something from a private chat that he participated in a few months ago, in which he suggested that 27N do a piece where they stamped billetes, currency, right, bills, with logos of 27N and the San Isidro movement and like political phrases, kind of repeating a gesture that's been done by artists like Sildo Mireles, and, you know, a lot of Polish dissidents did this as well, and so on. But the group decided not to do it, I get, for whatever reason. Either it wasn't on the top of their list of priorities, or they thought it would be dangerous. But on the basis simply of having suggested that, he's now in prison, right? This was an idea that was never carried out, but the accusation is that he's inciting to commit a crime. So in response to all this nonsense, several of his friends at the Arco Art Fair this summer did the piece in Spain. They made the stamps. They said, bring your money, we will stamp your stamp. You know, we're going to do what Hamlet can't do right now because he's in prison. And we have a plan to do it again, you know, at the Miami art fairs at the end of November. So those are things that will happen in, you know, real time and real space. As for what happened to me at the beginning, the explanation at the time, you know, I mean, street protest is illegal in Cuba. Right. So it is, I mean, it's considered, you know, all these people who have been detained, there are hundreds of people in detention who have not yet been tried from the July protests, because it's considered like, you know, public disturbance and disorderly conduct. And, you know, I mean, there's just a million categories in the penal code for how you can arrest people for demonstrating publicly, right? So in 2011, Cubans were not ready to make that move. And they also did not have a means of communicating horizontally, simultaneously, the way that they do now because of internet being on the phone. That's what happened in July. That, you know, now people are on Facebook, they're on their phones. One guy says, hey, look, there's 10 people standing outside protesting in this little town. Wouldn't you like to join them? Right. And then suddenly there's like 50 protests all over the island and thousands of people out there. Right. And that's because of the access. Going back to what you said about the difference between an art piece and activism, I do think that you are right, that there's a kind of contemplative reception mode with art that is not the mode of reception in activism. There's a kind of a pragmatism in activism, a very explicit state of goals, you know, statement of goals, that if you try to do that in art, you're just gonna fuck up. Because, you know, you can't control what people think. You don't know always who is going to be there. You don't know what cultural baggage they bring, but you can create in an artwork a space of reflection for on issues, ideas, materials, phenomena, whatever, that you wouldn't otherwise have. And I think that's what art is for. Now, that doesn't mean that you know, people outside of those who make the work can't instrumentalize the work for activist purposes, or, you know, criminalize the work. I mean, we don't really control that much about what happens to our work once we're done with it. So sometimes you find, I mean, when I was in the cage with Guillermo almost 30 years ago in Madrid, these journalists came, took a picture of us and put a picture in a big magazine, a glossy magazine there called Cambio 16, and said that we were Indians behind bars and that we were from the Amazon and that we were there to protest the celebration of the Columbus quincentenary. Well, we're not from the Amazon, and we were not there to do a protest, and it was not, you know, and we're not indigenous, but others decided to make it into that. You know, you understand what I'm saying?
Maybe in terms of this point about the difference between art and activism, Naeem, can you go back to what you said earlier about a useful work in the context of your invisibility, visibility work, and how you might parse those different pieces?
Yeah, maybe I'll connect it also with two comments that I'm seeing in the Q&A, because a few phrases jumped out. One person wrote about how we see the site of violence in terms of the aftermath, and another person asked about, again, using aftermath, saying how do you process the aftermath emotionally, physically, and visually. One of the things that I've thought about, and this is related quite strongly with the examples I showed from Visible Collective and from Hassan as well, is that our way of both emotionally processing and expressing in form the works had a heavy layer of irony always. There would be irony in the title, you know, the parts that were in brackets after the main title. So Casual, Fresh, American Style was the name of the piece in the window. And then within brackets, with apologies to Gap, which obviously we don't mean any apology to Gap, but that's how you also signpost at this, by the way, is a riff on Gap. Or Nahnu Wahad, but then within brackets, really are we one, is a way of pushing back against this unified quote unquote Muslim identity. There's always an ironic undertone. There's a knowing look at your fellow artists who might be in the group show and the curators, because that's who your dialogue usually is starting with while designing the work. And then there's a second look at the presumed audience that will arrive opening and afterwards. And that assumes a sort of commonality of understanding that, oh, we must be united somehow in our critical lens of Sarah Jessica Parker and the Sex and the City television phenomenon at the same time that all of this is going on, or a certain kind of smooth multicultural models as presented by Gap. You know, even the Italian Vogue magazine piece, the assumption is that if you mention Steven Meisel, you immediately invoke Madonna and a certain amount of like high gloss photography. And here's Steven Meisel now doing a photograph a splashy gatefold series about supposedly these models getting pulled over and interrogated at airports. The assumption is that we all understand, not that it's a joke, but we all understand that this is something that can only be dealt with irony and juxtaposition. And then where you collide with the audience is the refusal to accept irony, right? Either to not process the irony, which is what really happened with Rajiv Dabatkar, where he said, why have you done a website with a list of people not allowed into the US? Right? Where it's opposite intention to highlight that the US has ejected these people. So he didn't read our language. And then we went back and forth, and eventually he understood and saw us as some kind of allies. The other thing is that people will often say it's not respectful, right? That's a very common pushback. Since one person mentioned Belfast, Northern Ireland, I have a film called Of Sun's Long Day, which has a sequence about the death of Baader Meinhof members in Stamheim prison. And I have a certain voiceover language around it. And in Ireland, there was a very strong pushback in Northern Ireland, because to talk about anyone who was in prison and died in prison, my language wasn't acceptable because there was irony in it, and that's not the acceptable language to talk about it. And there's very sharp pushback. And that's not even about, that this work originated in a museum and now it's showing in an auditorium where presumably a more activist audience comes, because I don't know what that actually, I think that's a false distinction. I think just as many people who are activists by orientation and life calling could have come to the museum show as well. But it's about maybe the freedom in the Northern Ireland context to push back and say, okay, you're an invited guest, but this language we reject. As they're not doubting that it's a political work. People have the right to push back and say, this is not the language with which you should be talking about this, right? Which comes to perhaps a question of reverence, respect, maybe softly speaking. I think irony is always a bit suspect, that it doesn't have enough at stake. Because if your life and death is at stake, then you wouldn't even be able to manage an ironic distance. And that's also a fair critique, right? I mean, somebody might look at the drone and say, if that's a reality in their own country, like actually the reality, as opposed to someone living in New York and theorizing about it, in which I include myself, they might say, I can't even stand to look at this because this is reminding me of death from the skies. That's my reality. Death from the skies is not my, Sam or Coco's reality, at least so far. So we might be able to just look at the piece and think about its impact, right? As Sam knows, we face situations where we feel we're all in this together. We're trying to work something out. We all have our different languages, and then we collide with a community or an audience or an individual who says, no, but really you cannot use this language. I don't accept this language. And I think that's something, I've thought about it a lot, because I feel there's an assumption of a certain language that we're quite facile and used to using in our context. And then the moment we step outside of it, however that might be, maybe by a word leaking onto the web or getting social mediatized, then suddenly you're a terrain with people where your beginning sentence might be, but I'm down with this cause. I've worked with this ... You're like PV of past involvement. But by then it's too late, because it's already gone into a space where people don't accept and have the right to not accept pushback on your terms of reference, on your terms of language.
And then in terms of softly speaking and this potential for language clashes, how do you, or to what extent do you anticipate an audience in a certain setting, in a public setting, in a gallery, a museum, online, etc.? How much do you take that into account, or does it really depend on the artwork and each time that it's exhibited?
Can I say something about this?
Please.
I am, the kind of gadfly free speech advocate, and will continue to be until the day I croak. All right. And I find that this climate of policing artists that has taken over the art world in the name of whatever it is, the rights of what this or that group, or the people being offended or triggered, or all of that, is extremely dangerous. And nobody is dragging you into a gallery or museum or to the High Line. If you don't want to see something, don't go. But please don't make a campaign or legitimate these campaigns for policing people, censoring artists, and clamping down. this began during the culture wars. And suddenly signs started popping up in museums that you can't take minors in this room and you can't go here and you can't do that. And it's gotten worse and worse. And I don't think that this is about being respectful of people. Sometimes it's about audience conservatism. Sometimes it's about closed-mindedness. Sometimes it's about insisting that it's your way or the highway, which is not a very hospitable way to engage with art. And I don't make work for a particular audience. My mother hated all the art that I made. Too bad. I mean, like, I had to grow up and accept that I wasn't making it for her. So, I think that, like, I have to say, sometimes I have an idea of what the audience is. Sometimes I don't. I don't control that. We don't control that. And I'm certainly not going to start tailoring, what I make as an artist, because I'm afraid that there's some member of an audience who's going to sue me because I included a word in my piece. I mean, I just, I can't see how anyone with a reasonable person who understands what art making is about can really sustain these positions. It's highly suspect. Never produced good results. Okay, we have plenty of models of countries that engage in routine, systematic censorship of art practice. Does anybody in this room want to live there? I don't.
If the question isn't about holding back or changing your practice,
well, but we are talking about that. We are talking about that because as soon as we start worrying about who they are and what they're going to think and how we're in the realm of, self-censoring and controlling and guiding. And, institutions, cultural institutions do this to artists all the time, especially artists of color who are supposed to speak for a community and not offend their community and do this and that. And it is extremely stultifying and overly controlling, that all that concern about audience. People don't like something, so what? So what if they don't like it? Big deal. I mean, most avant-garde art has not been liked in the history of art. So does that mean now that we have to worry about that? I don't worry about it. I refuse to worry about it because I know what road that takes me down.
But I think, Coco, to say that I'll never worry about anything and I'm, somebody wrote First Amendment for all is also an absolutist position. Our minds might go to the easy examples, one word that offends, and then it's very easy to say, well, no, that people should do whatever. But I'm sure if we, are around long enough and we see enough things, we will see something where we're like, well, no, this worries me because of its implications,
And have an intelligent conversation about it instead of having the museum come down and shut the show down.
Somebody who has made a work that actively says this group of people in the United States should be shot dead. Is that something for which we would say First Amendment for all and let's give it a prominent?
Well, first of all, I highly doubt that a work like that would get airtime anywhere.
You can see there are always examples. There are
but you're using an extreme example to and then justify the practice of censorship. We don't need to have a regime of censorship to protect us from those extreme cases. We need to have rational conversation and a decision of whether or not you want to participate, which is, it's a matter of choice. If you don't want to do it, don't go. I mean, I'm sure there are like heavy metal tunes that are pretty violent in their lyrics, but I'm certainly not going to shut those musicians down because I don't have to listen.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think this is a really important discussion right now and in the past few years, of course. But I don't think Naeem is really arguing for self-censorship or for. I think it's more he's arguing for actually the same thing you are, Coco. I think, which is a civil discourse, right? I mean, he's talking about people in Northern Ireland pushing back. They're not trying to shut down his film. but they're disagreeing with it, and there's a disagreement there. And I think that's one of the things that's really lost, is that we're going to the extreme. As soon as someone disagrees, take it down, get rid of it, right?
Yeah, look what just happened with the Gustin show. I mean, that's
yeah,
the world that we're operating in. It's like,
exactly.
Oh, we're not even talking about a conflict that actually arose. We're talking about the possibility of there being a conflict, and then we have to shut it down before it happens.
Yeah, but that's institutional politics, and institutions are totally risk averse. And
Now
in this,
now they are.
Well, especially.
But I'm worried about the language that has developed that endorses this position, because it's getting worse. I mean, I deal with it in the classroom all the time, of students policing each other about who can talk about what and who's allowed to speak for whom. And, oh my God, you can't learn in an environment like that.
It's true. It's impossible without being able to talk, because if you can't talk, the only resort is really violence, and that is either the use of force or the end of the discussion, right?
Or silence.
Or silence.
Yeah, the silence, exactly. The removal of whatever it is that's offensive. So yeah, that's a real problem. I don't, I mean, one of the things that I think for me, doing public art with what happened with Scaffold is the intersection of a lot of different things. But the main thing is, I think that with public art, where, I mean, there is literally no control over who is going to see the work. So there's a high degree of risk there. And, I mean, after going through what I went through with Scaffold, I'm not interested in doing that again. And so, you could say my response working on the drone was to learn from what happened with Scaffold, because it wasn't productive. It turned out not. I thought it might be at the beginning. This could be productive. This could create new relationships between the Walker Art Center, the Dakota community, and artists, but it didn't, because of the many failures.
I think the question can also be about understanding the context. So not necessarily censorship or changing the work because of the context, but thinking about the larger picture. So like Sam, for the work on the Highline, thinking about series like this, thinking about educational materials that are available, thinking about what's there for someone who is coming and taking a photograph, doesn't necessarily know what it is. There's only so much context that you can have on that site, because there are so many different viewpoints, but all of the different intersections that aren't necessarily just the artwork. And so, my question also is about not necessarily just context in terms of the art world, but Coco, also with your work as well, when you're collaborating with journalists, when you're collaborating with activists, when there is a more explicit goal at hand, how those collaborations are functioning, and how the work can be mobilized if there is an intended mobilization.
Well, in the case of the Padilla piece, we wanted to bring attention to that anniversary, the 50th anniversary, because we wanted to draw a parallel between the repression of this artist in 1971 and a broader mechanisms of repression against artists in the present. In other words, there's no advance here, right? There's no progress. It's getting worse. So we strategically released the work on the anniversary to trigger that conversation, right? But that doesn't mean that, but when I'm in the editing room trying to figure out what it should look like and which performances are effective and who I should put next to whom, and, who's, like, I am not worrying there about, politics. And, in terms of collaboration, I mean, most of the people that I deal with are pretty aware of art and understand what it is. And even if they're not artists, and if they choose to participate, it's because they understand what an artwork is and they want to be part of it. I mean, I'm working right now with 2 former political prisoners, and they want to be, they want to be in a movie because they like the idea. They don't have to be artists. It's not really a problem.
May I take it in a slightly different direction, connecting with what Sam had said earlier, and also a few of the comments that are coming in the Q&A. Perhaps another tangent to this is also about what happens to the work when it travels. Because in a way, and I don't just mean physically, but I mean from one medium to another. In a way, the example that I'm sure is part of what's in Coco's mind is what she has written about extensively. And of course, Sam has invoked scaffold. These are also examples of what happens when a work is germinated in one context, seemingly has a reception that is nuanced discussion, but nothing gets, no red, I hate this term, but no flags go up. And then it travels to somewhere else in a different context, right? Scaffold first debuted in Germany and traveled for some time. And I've always wondered why these conversations didn't come up in Germany. One may be Germany versus United States situation populations. One might be time also, right? When the work first came out and later. The case or cases that Coco has written about extensively, one of the things that happens with the piece in the Whitney is that it travels from the physical space into social media at a certain speed. And is, regardless of what the reception could have been to the work, if you had physically walked into the space, you're not physically in the space anymore. It's one piece in isolation with a very dramatic headline invoking instant reaction, which is what also social media does. It accelerates the reaction. In my example, Afsan's Long Day was made in 2014. It didn't show in Northern Ireland until like 2.5, 3 years later. That means in that time it circulated in Bangladesh, in Germany, in the United States, without anyone ever invoking, this isn't how you should talk about somebody who died in prison. That, one of the pushbacks in Ireland was that, my voiceover seems to uncritically accept the German state's version, which is that Baader-Meinhof members commit suicide inside the prison. And they felt that you just couldn't even say that. It had to leave open the possibility of state assassination, which is the other theory. But what I'm struck by is it took 3 years for me to hit a sharp audience reaction. Respectful, but sharp, right? And so maybe that's also something to think about. Sam's current commission is at the High Line in New York City in a context where we assume that everyone will understand that this is a anti-war, anti-surveillance, critical of the American state work. The press around it or these events even will make it clear. The pieces, this series is called Normalizing Gaze, all these things do this thing. Then I wonder what would happen if the commission for Sam was somehow in Islamabad in Pakistan by some collector who decided, I want a Sam Durant piece, hypothetically, and it's in their garden and somebody sees it from outside. And I apologize, I'm using a very exaggerated example. Maybe Pakistan isn't the right place, but I'm just saying that's about as dramatic a distinction from the High Line I could make. And there the reaction would be that which is death from the skies in somebody's garden as a work piece. Whatever the politics of this artist, this is just too much, right? And so maybe a lot of things go. I don't mean to ever suggest, and I perhaps spoke too quickly earlier, that we should restrain what we're making. But for me, the audience responses, especially the unexpected responses, for me personally, are part of the work. That's how the work becomes this unexpected thing 2-3 years after its germination. Part of the thing with Rajiv Davatkar, this software engineer, isn't just that he surfs the internet and found the work. He also Googles his own name, right? Which means that he is maybe trying to clear his name. And then he reads this work as somebody's built a website of people who shouldn't be allowed in. Part of the reason for that is he's in India trying to get a new visa to come back to the United States. Maybe if he was a green card or US citizen working at Microsoft, he could look back at this and say, oh, this funny thing happened to me, isn't it interesting? But once the correct authorities looked at it, they cleared me. Like one of the reasons, I've said this to Hassan Elahi, he's of Bangladeshi origin, but he's a US citizen. One of the reasons he could immediately take an ironic gaze at the FBI detaining him at an airport in the United States in 2002, 2003 is he's a US citizen. So he had this discourse, he inhabited it, which was a little bit of like, how dare you, right? And 2003, I wasn't a US citizen. I didn't feel how dare you. And I felt that if I had been stopped at an airport, I know that I would have just sort of wanted to do everything possible to leave and go home, as opposed to Hassan's response was to sass the authorities and then go do this massive project that's a massive sort of, hey, he said this, he went on the Colbert show and said, well, the FBI stops me, so I basically say, hey guys, don't stop me, I'm just going to give you all the data, right? That's also coming from a position, and then the audience might be coming from different positions. And I say again, in the aftermath of 9/11, artists would be invited to panels and their identity was presumed immigrant, presumed Muslim, or presumed from one of the affected communities. And the conversation would be as if the person sitting on stage exemplifies the danger. And, I mean, we said multiple times, we're 9 or 10 members of Visible Collective. The fact that we're sitting in the Queen's Museum already shows that we're in a position through culture, through work, that we have the level of safety to speak. And the people who really are affected don't even have the space to come in here. If invited, they might not even come because they might say, no, I don't want to get it. So I think these are also parts of the conversation about the work and the work's reception after the work is made and is out in public.
Yeah, I still think that that it is a kind of going off on a tangent that isn't representative of what the larger cultural climate is now, of clamping down and basically punishing people for speaking in the context of culture because of notions of cultural property and rights and who has the right to speak, which is sort of the dominant discourse of the cultural milieu and of the educational milieu. It's not about actual people in danger who might be affected by one's work. If I know in the process of making something that I'm doing something that might actually affect somebody in real life, I consult them first. I mean, it's like if I'm basing something on somebody's real life or commenting on something, then I consult them and reach an agreement with the people who are represented in my work so that they don't feel maligned. And I also feel that, I am in good graces with them and move from there. But what I don't like are, and what I don't accept as politically valid are people who decide that, oh, you get too much attention, Missy, so I want to take the attention and now I'm going to tell you how to do things, right? You can't talk about this. You shouldn't be doing work like this. If anybody from the Cuban government singles me out for criticism, I go out for a glass of wine, okay? I want that criticism. Like, I want them to disagree with me. I want that, right? And many of my colleagues. So I'm not going to make a blanket rule of like, oh, I have to worry, because sometimes I do want to piss people off, or institutions, and I want to have the right to do it.
Coco, there's a question here from the audience, and I'm realizing that we are already over time and we could keep talking for 2 more hours. And this, I think, is somewhat connected to what you're speaking about, maybe coming from somewhere else, but I think it's interesting to apply. As artists whose work responds to the strategies and tactics of government and larger cultural forces, how do their approaches affect your own artistic strategies and tactics? Is it possible for artists to be primarily actors or always reacting and responding? Maybe also to think about artists' responsibility as actors within the culture that you're talking about, Coco. Is there a responsibility there?
Every time you talk to artists about responsibility, you piss them off. So I don't talk about responsibility. I talk about what people want to prioritize in their practice and what they're interested in doing. And, if I have an artist friend who wants to paint flowers or take pictures of dogs, I don't really criticize them for wanting to do that. That's their business. I want to do something else. I have a different orientation, right? I like to deal with political conflict and trauma and tragedy in my work because those are the subjects and that's the material that I'm drawn to. But I'm not going to demand that everybody else do that. Of course, I wonder about people who live in this world with the amount of tragedy, trauma, crisis, and everything else that goes on and that ignore it. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to turn that into a mandate about what they're responsible to do as artists. Because as soon as I start doing that, and everybody leaves, they leave, you're like, what do you call it? A wet blanket, right?
Naeem and Sam, maybe a couple of closing thoughts on this question that's pissing off all artists.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're artists, we're people. And so we have the same rights and responsibilities that everyone does, and I don't really look at it, I think about my responsibility as a citizen, as a person in the world, etc. Yeah, I echo Coco's sentiments exactly. I love you know, I love beauty. I mean, and abstraction and like all different kinds of art. And I certainly don't want to make anyone do art like I do. I just do what I just do the art I do because that's what interests me. That's what you know, I can't stop thinking about. So yeah.
Maybe I can respond by bringing up something that hasn't come before, relevant for me. There's a lot of language play in the projects I do, and the Visible Collective project is a group of us, so all of our flows. But for example, in the first works, it's still Steven Meisel's photographs, distorted slightly through this filter, and then our only intervention is the text itself. And the text is meant to be ironic, right? Wants to meet the models to ask how they have such a smooth time in the airport. And the language of many of these projects have almost always been in English, as opposed to the language I grew up speaking, which is Bengali. And for me, there's a bifurcation in my mind of, in English, I find it sometimes more organic to be sarcastic and ironic, and in Bengali I feel I'm more sentimental, and I've felt over the last 20 years that sentimental is not how I want to be about these topics, so a lot of works are in English. And then just speaking, I mean, I'm actually, I don't feel, and I know we're not giving the exact same examples, Coco's situation, Sam's situation, as artists and as teachers are different from mine. Each of us are constantly having different experiences. But for me, the audience loop is very much part of what goes into my mind for the next work. And I'm struck by this thing. A friend of mine, Firoz Ahmed, is a political organizer in Bangladesh, said to me a couple of years back, he just refuses to read or access material that I've done in English. And when I give him this explanation that, well, I want to be ironic and sarcastic, and so he pushes back by saying, no, but you speak. There's that word responsibility again. You have a responsibility to engage in a discourse in a language that pertains to actually only one region of the world, right? Bengali pertains to Bangladesh and West Bengal in India primarily. And there's this whole complication that we live within, which is that English is now default lingua franca. And in the visual art, maybe English, German, French, maybe, right? So that's like another thing going on, which is that I will make the works in the language that organically seems to appear to me, which in many cases is in English. But then afterwards, I feel that there's an audience that I wasn't able to connect to because the choice of the language being English was not only ironic, which the audience has every right to push back on, but it's somehow distance. You are using a language, not your mother tongue, but that allows, that's why the work could go to Northern Ireland, right? And Germany. Presumably the audience understood English in both cases, versus if the film was in Bengali, it would circulate, but with subtitles. I'm kind of maybe crushing too many things together into one line of thought. But this is an example where, when the audience pushes back in a different kind of way, which is about the form and the language, I don't mind that, because I feel that that's the world I live in anyway, this connective tissue, where I'm constantly also questioning what I think I know. And the way I usually find out that things are not the way I know is to encounter somebody who disagrees with me. But of course, hopefully in the language of polite discussion, or even sharp discussion, but respectful discussion. That's what you always hope for. And I will say one other thing. I've always found that the sharp, critical, but respectful and productive discussions happen face to face, like in Ireland, in a space where we're all sitting together and able to go out afterwards and continue the discussion. Or I've had one in Japan where somebody very sharply disagreed with my portrait of the Japanese Red Army in the film United Red Army. But still, we're all sitting together. They're disagreeing strongly, but they're with me. And I feel that some of the other examples we're talking about, which of course Coco, Sam, and I we've all experienced, are also situations where I feel that things are taken out of face to face and gone into this other ethereal space where things can travel without human beings attached to them, right? Where they're disembodied text or disembodied opinions. And I'm exaggerating a little bit. There are people attached to it, but it's of course always easier to be sharper in a less productive way when you're not physically in the same room.
Well, then we will have to continue this, Sam, the next time you are in New York, and we can all be in 3D rather than in squares. I hate to cut us short, but we are over time. Thank you so much, Sam, Coco, Naeem, for this incredible conversation that I can't wait for us to continue. Also, quick thanks to Constanza and Nadia, everyone behind the scenes, making all of these conversations possible. And I want to give a quick shout out to our advisors who've been guiding us along this entire project and the process of contextualization, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Immigrant Defense Project, Media Justice, Mi Gente, Empower Change, and Reprieve, as well as the members of the Highline Plinth Committee who make the Plinth program and this entire series possible. And of course, last but not least, everyone here who's joined us, thank you so much for being here this evening. To learn more about all of these topics and more about algorithms and artificial intelligence, as well as surveillance in our upcoming conversations, join us on September 29th at 6 p.m. Eastern for the 4th event in our series called Digital Sanctuary Cities, Surveillance, Immigration, and Protecting Black Descent with Mizui Ayazeke, Jacinta Gonzalez, and Karen Quoney. To learn more about the following events and sign up for our newsletter, do visit the links in the chat. We will keep them live for a couple of minutes. Thank you again, all, and we'll see you soon.